The air over Berbice was heavy with the scent of rotting sugarcane and human misery. The Dutch planters called it paradise, a place where the sun never rested and the fields bled gold. But for the men and women chained in those fields, it was hell wrapped in green. Every day began before dawn, with the crack of a whip splitting the mist, and ended long after the sun had boiled the skin off their backs. They labored until their bodies broke, and when they fell, they were replaced, like tools, like beasts, like nothing at all. Beneath the endless rows of sugarcane, whispers began to stir. Quiet, cautious, dangerous whispers. They spoke of nights without chains, of mornings without overseers, of a future no one dared name aloud. Among them stood one man who listened more closely than the rest, whose silence carried the weight of storms. His name was Cuffy. The Dutch believed they owned the land. They believed they owned the people. But in the sweltering fields of Berbice, something older than fear was awakening, something that would soon turn the Empire's paradise into a graveyard. The Dutch masters believed they had perfected efficiency. On their ledgers, every soul brought from the African coast was a number, an investment, a tool to extract profit from the lush colony of Berbice. They built their wealth on the backs of human beings they did not consider human at all. To them, a man was not a man. He was an engine of muscle, a pair of hands to cut cane, haul timber, or carry stones until his body failed. When he did, he was discarded, written off as if he were a broken plow. The plantations were sprawling prisons dressed in green. Sugarcane stretched for miles, their stalks swaying gently as if mocking the agony beneath. Overseers on horseback patrolled the fields with whips curled like snakes in their hands. The crack of leather on bare flesh was a sound that stitched itself into the minds of those who survived long enough to remember. It was not punishment for disobedience, it was routine, a rhythm of control. For every lash, the masters claimed it was discipline. But discipline implies the hope of betterment, and there was no such hope in Berbice. It was simply domination, pure and unrelenting. Men were beaten for working too slowly. Women were beaten for weeping. Children were beaten for existing. The Dutch called this order. By the end of each day, the enslaved were little more than shadows. Their hands were blistered and raw from the machetes used to slice through cane, their backs warped from carrying sacks heavier than their own bodies. Nights brought no comfort. They were herded back to crude huts, thin walls of mud and thatch where the heat lingered and the air stank of mildew and sickness. Food was a mockery. A handful of cassava, a splash of salted fish if they were lucky, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger hollowed them, gnawed at their ribs, dulled their eyes. Disease came easily in such a place: malaria, dysentery, fevers that burned the body from the inside. The masters saw no reason to treat them. If one slave died, another would be purchased. Life was cheap, profit was not. And yet, somehow, they endured. They remembered the lands they had been stolen from, villages where drums once beat like living hearts, where mothers sang lullabies under starlit skies, where fathers taught sons to hunt, craft, and dream. That world had been wrenched from them, but its memory lingered like embers hidden under ash. At night, when the overseers were gone and the fields lay silent, they spoke softly to one another in fragments of their old languages. They whispered prayers. They hummed songs that had crossed the Atlantic with them, buried in their bones. It was their only wealth now, memory, and each other. But even memory can grow thin under constant suffering. The despair on the plantations was not just physical, it was spiritual. The Dutch sought to break not only bodies but minds. They enforced silence, forbade gatherings, and punished any hint of defiance with spectacular cruelty. Public whippings that tore flesh from bone, executions designed to be watched, to burn fear into every witness. Some tried to run. Most were caught. The punishment was slow and meant to linger. Others chose a different escape, slipping into the dark waters of the river at night, stones tied to their ankles, choosing death over another sunrise in chains. For those who stayed, despair settled like a fog. They rose before dawn, worked until their vision blurred, then stumbled back to their huts to collapse. Days blurred into each other until they forgot what freedom had ever felt like. It was not life, It was survival on the thinnest edge. And yet even fog can break. The breaking point came quietly, not with a shout but with a stare. It passed through the fields like an unspoken current, a tension in the air heavier than the humidity. Overseers noticed it but could not name it. The enslaved had grown tired not just in their muscles, but in their fear. Fear requires energy, and theirs had been spent. There comes a moment when suffering ceases to frighten because it has become the only language one knows. And once fear dies, the enslaved are no longer controllable. They began to watch their masters with new eyes, not as gods, not as owners, but as men of flesh and blood who could be cut, who could bleed, who could fall. The overseer's whips seemed less like weapons and more like threads trying to hold back a flood. Among the enslaved, there were quiet conversations at the edges of the fields. A glance held too long. A nod that said more than words could. No plans yet, no weapons forged, only the shared realization that the life they were living was no life at all. That realization, once felt, cannot be unlearned. The Dutch believed they had created an unshakable order, that their system of control was eternal. But they had built it on the assumption that the enslaved would never stop fearing them. They did not understand that fear, like any resource, can be exhausted. And in Berbice, fear was running out. The masters saw only obedience in the bowed heads, but beneath those bent spines was something far older than their empire. It was not rage. Rage burns out too quickly. It was endurance, and endurance hardens into something even more dangerous: resolve. That resolve did not yet have a name, but soon it would. Soon, it would have a voice, a face, and a sword. Soon, it would be called Cuffy. The first spark was almost invisible, like a dry leaf catching a whisper of flame. In the humid heat of February 1763, deep inside the plantations of Berbice, whispers passed from one enslaved person to another like secret embers in the dark. The suffering had gone on for decades: chains, beatings, families torn apart, and lives traded like tools. But even in the depths of despair, something ancient and human had survived in them: the belief that freedom was possible. And that belief was about to ignite. It began on a small, isolated plantation along the Conjuring River. A handful of enslaved men, exhausted from endless days cutting sugarcane under the whip, laid down their machetes, and picked them up again as weapons. In the darkness before dawn, they moved like shadows through the cane fields, silent and determined. Their first strike was sudden and devastating. Overseers who had ruled with iron fists were caught off guard, their power crumbling in an instant. The plantation house, once a symbol of wealth and domination, went up in flames. Smoke rose into the pale sky, carrying with it the first scream of rebellion. News traveled faster than anyone expected. Across the scattered plantations of Berbice, enslaved people listened to the rumor with a mix of disbelief and hope. Could it be true? Had their brothers actually done it? Had they fought back and lived? Within days, what had been only whispers became a roar. The spark leapt from estate to estate, a chain reaction of defiance. Men who had labored with broken backs stood tall. Women who had endured unspeakable violence armed themselves with blades, stones, or whatever they could find. Children ran messages through the dense forest trails. Every strike on a plantation echoed like a drumbeat of liberation. The violence escalated quickly. What began as small, coordinated attacks became waves of uprising. European masters, accustomed to absolute control, suddenly found themselves hunted in the same fields where they had once given orders. Mansions burned, their whitewashed walls collapsing in showers of sparks. Cane fields that had soaked up the sweat and blood of the enslaved now drank the blood of their former masters. For the rebels, it was not mindless slaughter, it was retribution, a desperate push to tear down a system that had dehumanized them for generations. Colonial records later described rivers of blood running through Berbice, and while the language was drenched in fear, it was not far from the truth. By the end of the first wave, dozens of plantations lay in ruins. More than 200 European colonists had been killed, many while trying to flee. For the enslaved, this was not just revenge, it was the first breath of freedom. The old order was collapsing. And in the chaos, one figure began to rise from among the rebels, a man named Cuffy. Cuffy had once been just another name on a ledger, another body chained to the machinery of sugar. But within him burned a vision larger than himself. He had been brought from West Africa years earlier, likely from the Akan people, who carried with them traditions of fierce independence and structured leadership. In the early days of the rebellion, Cuffy moved among the fighters with calm precision, organizing their scattered fury into strategy. He wasn't the loudest voice, but when he spoke, men listened. They began to call him General. Leadership, for Cuffy, was not about ego, it was about purpose. He saw clearly what many others could not yet imagine, that they weren't just burning plantations, they were birthing a revolution. The enslaved were no longer just reacting to oppression, they were seizing control of their destiny. Under Cuffy's command, the rebellion transformed from chaotic uprisings into a coordinated campaign. He divided the forces into units, assigned scouts to gather intelligence, and placed guards along the river routes to intercept any reinforcements coming from the Dutch coastal forts. For a man who had once been denied even the right to his own name, it was an astonishing transformation. Within weeks, Cuffy's army numbered over 3,000. They were farmers and blacksmiths, women and men, young and old, all bound by a single, unstoppable idea: freedom. They carried spears carved from plantation tools, muskets captured from fallen overseers, and the unshakable conviction that they would rather die as free people than live another day in chains. Entire families joined the march, leaving behind the burning skeletons of the estates that had enslaved them. As they moved, they sang ancestral war songs, their voices rising through the dense jungle like thunder rolling across the sky. To the Dutch colonists, it was a nightmare made flesh. Their carefully constructed world, their wealth, their plantations, their sense of superiority, was crumbling faster than they could comprehend. Panic spread through the colonial towns. Merchants abandoned their shops. Soldiers deserted their posts. Those who remained barricaded themselves behind walls, praying the rebels wouldn't come. But Cuffy was already thinking beyond mere destruction. He understood that to truly win, they had to build something new in the ashes. He began holding councils with his most trusted lieutenants, drafting plans not just for attacks but for governance. He envisioned a free republic in Berbice, ruled not by European masters but by the very people who had been enslaved. It was a vision decades ahead of its time, a blueprint for liberation. To the men and women who followed him, Cuffy was no longer just a warrior. He was becoming a symbol, a living proof that they could govern themselves, that they could rise from bondage and stand as equals among nations. And yet, the rebellion was far from secure. Even as Cuffy's forces swept across the colony, the Dutch were regrouping on the coast, rallying reinforcements from neighboring Suriname and even from Europe. But for the moment, Cuffy held the heart of Berbice in his hands. The plantations were silent except for the crackle of dying fires. The fields lay empty. And the people who had once labored there now stood beneath the open sky, free for the first time in their lives, watching the horizon not with fear but with fierce, defiant hope. It's hard, centuries later, to truly grasp what that must have felt like, the sheer audacity of it. Imagine spending every day of your life told that you are nothing, only to rise up and rewrite history with your own hands. It was reckless. It was bloody. It was imperfect. But it was also one of the most extraordinary acts of self-liberation in the history of the Americas. For the rebels, it was not just a revolt. It was the birth of a new world. The smoke had barely cleared from the charred fields when Cuffy did something no one expected from a man who had risen from chains. He began to build. For months, Berbice had been a land of fire and fury, of plantations collapsing under the weight of rebellion. Now, for the first time in its history, it stood without masters. The Dutch were pushed back to a handful of coastal forts, cowering behind cannons and thick walls, while the vast interior of the colony lay in the hands of the very people who had once been enslaved. To the rebels, this was more than victory, it was a blank canvas. And Cuffy, the former slave who had become their general, stepped forward to become something even more audacious, their head of state. It was April of 1763 when he gathered his commanders on the banks of the Berbice River. They met not in a palace but in the open air, beneath the towering ceiba trees that had witnessed centuries of pain. Men and women from dozens of plantations came, some still bearing scars from the whips of overseers, others carrying captured muskets across their shoulders like badges of honor. They sat in a rough circle as Cuffy rose to speak. His voice carried with quiet gravity. The war, he said, could not go on forever. If they were to survive, they needed more than victory, they needed order. That meeting became the seed of a new government. Cuffy proposed that they no longer live as scattered bands of warriors but as citizens of a free land. He called for the creation of a central council, composed of leaders elected from each liberated district, to guide the future of Berbice. It was radical. It was unthinkable to the world of European empires. And yet, to those who had once been treated as property, it felt like breathing for the first time. They called their new experiment a rebel republic. Cuffy was chosen, almost unanimously, as the head of this republic. He accepted not with triumph but with a solemn sense of duty. He understood that victory on the battlefield meant nothing if they could not hold what they had won. Over the next weeks, he moved through the countryside, issuing proclamations, mediating disputes, organizing supplies, and enforcing discipline among the rebel ranks. He understood something that every entrepreneur, every founder eventually learns: building something new is far harder than destroying the old. There were no blueprints for what he was trying to create. These men and women had never been allowed to own property, hold office, or make law. And yet they learned quickly. They rebuilt farmsteads on the ashes of plantations, not to serve distant masters but to feed their own people. They dug irrigation ditches, repaired canoes, and reopened trade routes along the rivers. They built workshops to forge tools and repair weapons. For the first time in living memory, the economy of Berbice was not fueled by chains, but by choice. Cuffy's leadership was marked by something rare: vision. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was thinking generations ahead. He issued decrees to prevent looting and revenge killings, warning that freedom would mean nothing if it descended into chaos. He spoke of building schools one day, where children would learn to read and write in their own language. He pushed for the restoration of spiritual ceremonies that had been banned by the Dutch, allowing people to reclaim their ancestral names and rights. What he offered was more than political control, it was the rebirth of dignity. But perhaps the most astonishing part of his leadership was his diplomacy. Cuffy understood that they could not remain isolated forever. The Dutch were wounded but not gone, and their empire stretched far beyond Berbice. So he did what no rebel leader had ever done: he opened negotiations. He sent letters, written by interpreters and messengers, to the Dutch governor, proposing a peace treaty. In those letters, Cuffy demanded recognition of the rebels as free people and offered to divide the colony. The Dutch could keep the coastal settlements, while the interior would remain under African rule. It was an audacious offer, and it sent shockwaves through the colonial world. A man who had once been enslaved was now speaking to European powers as an equal, offering terms as the head of a sovereign state. To the Dutch, it was unthinkable. To the rebels, it was electrifying. Cuffy was no longer just their general, he was their diplomat, their president, their symbol of what was possible. For 5 months, the rebel republic endured. It was not perfect. Supplies were scarce, and disease stalked their camps. Factions began to whisper, some questioning whether peace with the Dutch was even possible, others fearing that the Dutch would return with overwhelming force. But even with those tensions, something extraordinary unfolded. For the first time, the people of Berbice woke each morning not as someone's property but as free men and women, shaping their own future. They cultivated their fields without overseers watching. They gathered at night to dance to drums that had been silenced for decades. They married without needing permission. Children ran through the villages laughing, no longer afraid of being sold away. Those who experienced those months spoke of it for the rest of their lives, a brief, blazing glimpse of what freedom could feel like. It was fragile and precarious, but it was real. And in that short season, Cuffy's name became legend. To his people, he embodied the impossible: that someone born in bondage could rise to command an army, topple an empire's colony, and build a government from nothing. He carried himself with the calm intensity of someone who knew he was living on borrowed time but refused to waste it. Cuffy worked relentlessly. He barely slept, often traveling by canoe at night to inspect distant settlements or resolve disputes. He urged unity, warning that division would destroy them faster than any Dutch cannon. He spoke often of the future, of building a society that could trade, defend itself, and educate its children. Many who followed him said that what made him powerful was not just his courage, but his ability to make people believe in something larger than themselves. He had turned fear into hope, and hope into a nation. By late summer, however, the clouds of war began to gather again. The Dutch were regrouping on the coast, sending desperate calls for reinforcements to Suriname and Europe. Cuffy knew time was running out. But for those 5 months, before the tides turned, he gave his people something no one had ever given them before: the experience of self-rule. It was imperfect. It was fragile. But it was theirs. For entrepreneurs today, looking back across the centuries, there's something deeply familiar in what Cuffy did. He built a movement from nothing, turned chaos into structure, rallied people behind a vision, and tried to scale it into something lasting, all while the world doubted him. He understood, instinctively, what every founder learns in their bones: that leadership is not about titles, it's about responsibility. And that the hardest part is not winning freedom, but building something worthy of it. For 5 unforgettable months in 1763, deep in the jungles of South America, Cuffy and his people carved a republic out of fire and hope. And even though it would not last, its memory still burns, proof that even the most impossible dreams can become real, if only for a moment. For 5 fleeting months, Cuffy had stood atop a dream, a man born in chains who had reshaped a colony through fire and audacity. But dreams built in the shadow of empires are fragile things. Beneath the surface of Berbice's newfound freedom, fault lines were forming. And as history has shown time and again, revolutions rarely fall to outside enemies alone. More often, they crumble from within. At first, the tension was barely noticeable. The rebellion had grown so quickly that unity had been more necessity than choice. Men who had once stood side by side in battle began to clash over what came next. Some wanted to continue striking the Dutch relentlessly, believing only total annihilation of the colonists could secure their future. Others argued for fortifying their new settlements, conserving strength, and negotiating for recognition. Cuffy had chosen the latter. He believed that if they could demonstrate order and restraint, the Dutch might accept a peace that would make Berbice a free black territory. But not all of his lieutenants shared that patience, or that faith. One of them was Akira, a charismatic and ambitious commander who had risen rapidly through the rebellion's ranks. Akira believed that hesitation would kill them all. He saw the Dutch regrouping on the coast, their ships gathering supplies, their allies whispering of vengeance. Every day that passed, he argued, gave their enemies time to return with overwhelming force. To him, Cuffy's diplomacy looked like weakness, and weakness in a revolution is as dangerous as any enemy's sword. Whispers of dissent grew into open defiance. Some of Akira's men stopped obeying orders from Cuffy's central council. Small raids were launched without approval, reigniting cycles of violence that Cuffy had tried desperately to stop. It was the kind of slow, creeping erosion every leader fears, the unraveling of trust. What had once been a united army began fracturing into factions, each with its own loyalties and vision for Berbice's future. And while they quarreled, the Dutch prepared their return. Far away on the coast, the colonial authorities were gathering an army. Word of the rebellion had shocked Europe, and the Dutch West India Company could not allow such an uprising to stand. If Berbice remained in rebel hands, it might inspire other colonies to revolt. That was unthinkable for a mercantile empire built on slave labor. Ships began arriving from neighboring colonies and from Europe, carrying muskets, cannons, and hundreds of fresh troops. The Dutch did not just want to retake Berbice, they wanted to make an example of it. Cuffy knew they were coming. Scouts brought reports of ships massing at the river mouths, of soldiers drilling along the coast. He urged his commanders to stand together, to prepare a coordinated defense, but by then the cracks in his coalition had become chasms. Acra openly challenged his authority. Heated arguments erupted in council meetings. Some accused Cuffy of growing soft, of seeking peace when he should be wielding the sword. Others whispered that he wanted to be king. It was the oldest poison of revolutions: ego, envy, ambition, the same forces that topple companies and kingdoms alike. Then, as if to prove Acra's warnings right, the Dutch counterattack began. In early May, their fleet pushed up the rivers, cannons thundering through the mangrove swamps. Red-coated soldiers advanced behind walls of smoke and shot. The rebels, scattered and disunited, were caught off guard. Some fought bravely, ambushing Dutch columns from the forests, but without a unified command their efforts faltered. Others simply fled, slipping back into the jungle or surrendering in hopes of mercy. The disciplined line of Dutch soldiers cut through the fractured rebel forces like a blade through rotted rope. Villages the rebels had built were burned. Crops were destroyed. Survivors were hunted down with ruthless precision. Every day brought news of another rebel stronghold falling, another commander killed or captured. The people who had once danced in the open fields now hid in the shadows again, their songs replaced by silence. And in the heart of this unraveling storm stood Cuffy, watching everything he had built collapse around him. Leadership is often portrayed as strength, but in truth it is weight, the weight of expectations, of responsibility, of every soul who followed you into the unknown. Cuffy bore that weight alone now. His dream had been larger than most could grasp, not just rebellion, but a lasting republic carved from the soil of oppression. But dreams like that need unity, and unity had dissolved. Even his closest allies questioned him. When he called for one final stand, few came. It broke something inside him. Accounts from the time are fragmented, filtered through colonial reports and whispered oral histories, but they agree on one thing: as the Dutch closed in and the rebellion disintegrated, Cuffy made a choice that still echoes with tragic finality. Rather than be captured, paraded in chains, and executed as a warning to others, he walked away from the crumbling camp, into the forest, and ended his own life. Some say he used the same sword he had once carried at the head of his army. Others say he slipped silently beneath the black waters of the Berbice River, vanishing into the land he had tried to free. However it happened, he died as he had lived, on his own terms, refusing to kneel. In the days that followed, Acra took command of the remnants of the rebel army, but by then the rebellion was broken beyond repair. The Dutch crushed what resistance remained, retaking Berbice with brutal efficiency. Captured rebels were executed or re-enslaved. The plantations were rebuilt. The whips cracked once more. History rolled forward as if Cuffy's republic had never existed. But it had existed. And that is what matters. For 5 months, Cuffy had led one of the most extraordinary revolts in the history of the Americas. He had risen from slavery to command thousands, to govern a territory, to stand toe-to-toe with an empire. And though his revolution ended in ashes, it planted seeds that would outlive him. News of the uprising spread through the Caribbean, carried by sailors and merchants, whispered among the enslaved in sugar fields from Suriname to Saint-Domingue. Those whispers would grow louder in time, until they became the roar of future revolutions. Cuffy's fall was tragic, yes, but it was not failure. True pioneers rarely see the harvest of what they plant. They simply break the soil and trust that someone, someday, will carry the work forward. Cuffy's life was brief, his rule fleeting, but his defiance reshaped the imagination of a generation. He proved that empires could bleed. He proved that freedom could be seized, if only for a moment. And even in defeat, that moment matters. Because once people have tasted freedom, they never forget its flavor. Time eventually buried the ashes of the Berbice Rebellion, but it never buried Cuffy. Though the Dutch restored their rule, they could not erase the memory of a man who had dared to stand against an empire. Decades turned into centuries, and the land he once fought upon became the modern nation of Guyana. And there, Cuffy's name rose again, not as a rebel to be feared, but as a hero to be honored. Today, his bronze statue towers in the capital city of Georgetown, its clenched fists raised high, not in rage but in defiance. Each year, Guyana marks Cuffy Day, celebrating the spirit of independence and the unyielding will of a man who refused to remain chained. Children learn his story in schoolbooks. Artists paint his likeness. Poets speak his name as a promise that freedom is worth the cost, even when the price is everything. Cuffy never saw victory. But his rebellion planted a seed, an idea that people born in bondage could govern themselves, that dignity was not given by empires but claimed by the human soul. For anyone who has ever built something from nothing, who has risked failure to create change, his story still echoes. Freedom begins the moment you choose to believe in it. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. Here, we bring forgotten lives back to light, voices that dared, lost, and still became legends. Because their courage still belongs to all of us.